Welcome to Conversations with the Co-op, where we dive into essential topics in special education that challenge assumptions and aim to improve student outcomes. I'm your host, Lainey Sandberg, K-12 Special Ed Coordinator at the Paul Bunyan Education Cooperative. Today, we're going to reframe how we think about interventions and student placement. Are we testing the student or are we testing the supports? To walk us through this idea and provide some insight, we have Jeffrey Lee, another K-12 Special Ed Coordinator here at the Co-op. Jeff, welcome to the other side of the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this. It's such an important shift for teams to think about, and it really impacts the decisions we make for kids.
You've talked about shifting the mindset to start with the assumption that the student can succeed in general education if the right supports are in place. Why is this assumption so crucial, and how does it change the way teams approach student struggles? What does this mindset shift look like in practice?
Yeah, this is huge. When teams come together to talk about a student who's struggling, it's easy, sometimes almost automatic, to ask, does this student belong in this setting? But that question starts us off in the wrong place because it shifts the focus onto the student's deficits. Instead, we really need to flip it. Start with the assumption that the student can succeed, and if they're not, the real question is, what supports are missing and not working? When we do that, we're not testing whether the student belongs, but we're instead testing whether the student's supports and interventions are really doing what they need. And that's a critical mind shift. It challenges teams to problem solve and hold themselves accountable. Instead of assuming that the environment is the problem, we're asking, what else can we try? That's where the real work begins.
You've used a great analogy comparing the process of supporting students to a science experiment. In a lab, when an experiment fails, the scientist doesn't blame the subject. They change the conditions and try again. How does this analogy apply to schools, and how can it help teams rethink their approach to student interventions?
Yeah, I love this analogy. I don't love talking about students as experiments, but I do think using that scientific lab idea really provides context for people. In a science lab, let's say a plant doesn't grow in a certain soil. The scientist doesn't just throw up their hands and say, well, I guess this plant doesn't really belong here. Instead, they're asking what conditions need to change, like does it need more light, or do we need to change the water? Does it need a different type of nutrients? Now let's bring this back to the school. If a student isn't making progress, we don't just say, that student doesn't belong in this class. Instead, we need to really ask, what supports did we put into place, and were they done consistently and with fidelity? Did we adjust them when they didn't work? It's not about testing the student, it's about testing the supports. And that's hard work because it forces us as educators to look critically at what we are doing. Are the supports actually doing what they're supposed to do, or do we need to change the conditions and try again?
Turning this mindset shift into consistent practice is crucial, but how can teams make it happen in their day-to-day work? What are some concrete steps that teams can take to ensure they are truly testing the supports and using the data to drive their decisions?
You know, Lainey, that's a great question. It does take intentionality, but it's doable. I suggest starting with a clear process that teams can follow. First, document what you've already tried. What supports and interventions have been put into place? How consistently have they been implemented? And we need to know if the experiment was set up right in the first place. Is this really testing the thing that we thought it was going to test? Secondly, collect the data, not just on the student's progress, but also on the supports themselves. Were the supports done with fidelity? Did they match what the student actually needed? And I think about this, when you put a support in place, we're always measuring what the student is doing, and we don't always look at how often was that support given. So thinking of like a paraprofessional who is providing a support, are they giving the feedback at the rate that we expected them to give? Or was it given less often than we expected and we didn't see the progress made by the student? So collecting data on both of those things. Third, adjust and tweak as you go. If the data shows that the student isn't making progress, don't just jump to the conclusion that the environment is insufficient. We need to ask, what else can we try? What do we need to do differently? That might mean changing the intervention, increasing its intensity, or trying a completely different approach.
This has been such an important discussion, Jeff. When we focus on testing the supports instead of the student, We not only improve student outcomes, but we also empower ourselves as educators to continuously improve our practices. This shift enables us to provide every student with a real chance to succeed.
Absolutely. When we approach it this way, we're not looking to prove that a student doesn't belong. We're actually showing through our data and our effort that we've done everything that we can to make that environment work. Sometimes it doesn't work, and we're ultimately trying to prove that null hypothesis, right? That if I can't make this work, then this isn't probably the right setting.
Well said, and thank you, Jeff, for sharing your perspective and walking us through this important mindset shift. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Conversations with the Co-op. Stay tuned for more discussions on how we can challenge assumptions, improve practices, and create opportunities for all students. Until next time.